Chapter 8, A Written Confession. On February 4th, 2021, a mere 2 weeks and 1 day after Joe Biden's inauguration, skipped by Trump, the national media and cultural establishments remained abuzz with the narrative of a January 6th insurrection. Trump, who had left office without conceding, awaited acquittal by the Senate after his lightning-fast January 13th second impeachment in the House. It was at this very moment that an article appeared in Time magazine titled "The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election." Judging from the article's tone, its author, Molly Ball, was a hardcore anti-Trump partisan. In it, Ball admits and details, in plain English and with stunning candor, that Republican claims of conspiracy and manipulation of the election process by the likes of Mark Zuckerberg, social media gatekeepers, the AFL-CIO, the Democrat Party, and some anti-Trump Republicans, precisely what Trump supporters had been claiming for months in the face of withering and even violent ridicule from the left, were absolutely true. Ball now oozed praise for the cleverness of the cheaters. This chapter is a review and analysis of that article. Trump was right, Ball wrote of the president's December 2nd remark that, quote, "Within days after the election, we witnessed an orchestrated effort to anoint the winner, even while many key states were still being counted," unquote. She continued, quote, "There was a conspiracy unfolding behind the scenes, one that both curtailed the protests, that is, of those demanding election integrity, and coordinated the resistance from CEOs, that is, against a Trump second term. Both were the result of an alliance between left-wing activists and business titans. Both sides would come to see it as a sort of implicit bargain in which the forces of labor came together with the forces of capital to keep the peace and oppose Trump's assault on democracy," unquote. The author, however, did not present the actions of these parties as though they were nefarious. These cheaters were on the side of the good guys. Ball asserted that the true interest of these Trump opponents was merely, quote, "ensuring it would be free and fair, credible and uncorrupted," unquote, to counter the danger of, quote, "an autocratically inclined president," unquote. Ball continued to state that, quote, "The scenario the shadow campaigners were desperate to stop was not a Trump victory, but an election so calamitous that no result could be discerned at all," unquote. There is no indication that Ball saw irony in the statement. Next, Ball admitted the central complaint of the Texas lawsuit to have been true. The work of these conspirators, quote, "touched on every aspect of the election. They got states to change voting systems and laws and helped secure hundreds of millions in public and private funding. This is the inside story of the conspiracy to save the 2020 election. It is the story of an unprecedented, creative, and determined campaign whose success also reveals how close the nation came to disaster. Every attempt to interfere with the proper outcome of the election was defeated," says Ian Bassin, co-founder of Protect Democracy, unquote. Despite claiming to be a nonpartisan endeavor, the Protect Democracy website has a rabid anti-Trump bias. One would be justified in wondering what Bassin meant by preventing interference with the, quote, "proper outcome," unquote. It is an interesting choice of words, since an election's outcome is different from its process. An outcome is a specific result. This candidate won and that candidate lost. What outcome would Bassin have considered improper in 2020? I believe the answer is obvious from the context and from the tone of the Protect Democracy website. Returning to the Time article, Ball told us that the conspirators now wanted the secret history of the 2020 election told. In the remainder of this chapter, we will discuss what she presented. The hero and the problem. A cause needs a founding story, and a founding story needs a hero. Enter Senior Advisor to the President of the AFL-CIO, Mike Podhorzer, who, in the fall of 2019, quote, "became convinced the election was headed for disaster and determined to protect it," unquote. Who is this Mike Podhorzer? The question is soon answered. Quote, among Democrat insiders, he's known as the wizard behind some of the biggest advances in political technology in recent decades. A group of legal strategists he brought together in the early 2000s led to the creation of the Analyst Institute, a secretive firm that applies scientific methods to political campaigns. He was also involved in the founding of Catalyst, the flagship progressive data company, unquote. From the above, we may infer that Podhorzer is a serious Democrat progressive activist. Podhorzer is listed by Ball under the heading, The Architect. What was the specific nature of the looming disaster Podhorzer feared in late 2019? A newsletter sent by Podhorzer in October 2019 expressed concern about Trump himself trying to disrupt the election. He hypothesized what he called the two most likely outcomes: Trump losing and refusing to concede, or Trump winning the Electoral College, despite losing the popular vote, he hastened to add, by corrupting the voting process in key states. In other words, Podhorzer envisioned two likely possibilities: Trump loses but won't let go of power, or Trump wins by cheating. He does not seem to have imagined Trump capable of winning fair and square. The band of conspirators. Podhorzer, Ball reported, was soon contacted by other leftist groups, including the Fight Back Table, quote, a coalition of resistance organizations, unquote, who had been gathering local and national liberal activists under a label of Democracy Defense Coalition. Podhorzer, quote, spent months pondering scenarios and talking to experts, unquote, before concluding that the main problem with America's decentralized election system was that it, quote, couldn't be rigged in one fell swoop, unquote. That, Ball stated, presented an opportunity to shore it up. Podhorzer began, quote, holding back-to-back Zoom meetings for hours a day with his network of contacts across the progressive universe: the labor movement, the left-wing institutions like Planned Parenthood and Greenpeace, resistance groups like Indivisible and Move On, progressive data geeks and strategists, representatives of donors and foundations, state-level grassroots organizers, racial justice activists, and others, unquote. By April, hundreds from across the, quote, progressive movement, unquote, were attending. The meetings, Ball stated, quote, became the galactic center for a constellation of operatives across the left, unquote. The effort continued to grow and eventually, quote, reached across the aisle into the world of Trump-skeptical Republicans, appalled by his attacks on democracy, unquote. So far, the article reported one of the broadest coalitions of leftist and Democrat organizations and individuals ever assembled. Now, Ball stated, they were joined by anti-Trump Republicans. But remember that Ball stated the express purpose of the entire effort was to make sure the election was, quote, free and fair, credible and uncorrupted, unquote. Did this group of anti-Trump political activists that soon began meddling with the very process of the election itself sound like a coalition who didn't care who won so long as the contest was, quote, free and fair, credible and uncorrupted, unquote? They said they wanted to save the 2020 election. Were they truly trying to save the country from a dishonest election, or just from a Trump victory? Ball's ironic description of Trump as autocratically inclined, or of his efforts to ensure election integrity as plotting, do not suggest journalistic neutrality. The plan of action. Ball described a 3-page confidential memo that Podhorzer drafted and titled Threats to the 2020 Election. In it, he laid out 4 categories of challenges that he anticipated from Trump. 1. Attacks on voters. 2. Attacks on election administration. 3. Attacks on Trump's political opponents. And 4. Efforts to reverse the results of the election. Tellingly, all of Podhorzer's anticipated challenges were expected to emanate from Trump. He apparently anticipated no threat to democracy from the Democrats. Then, Ball said, COVID-19 burst onto the scene, and normal methods of voting, quote, were no longer safe, unquote, for voters or volunteers. She bemoaned what she calls, quote, Trump's crusade against mail voting, unquote, which she said, quote, prevented some states from making it easier to vote absentee and for jurisdictions to count those votes in a timely manner, unquote. Ball did not detail exactly how the president was able to block state legislatures from changing their own election rules. Is it possible that Democrats were merely frustrated that Trump was shining a light in their direction as they moved to circumvent those legislatures and usurp their plenary power? Whatever unspecified action Trump supposedly took to block the state legislatures from legislating, Ball said that chaos resulted. Democrat strongholds such as Milwaukee and New York, respectively, suddenly had trouble opening the full number of polling places and counting the votes in a timely manner. Somehow, Ball alleged, it was Trump's fault. So, Podharzer's weekly meetings, beginning in April 2020, were effectively uniting this coalition of anti-Trump activists across the nation into a galactic center of leftist operatives. She quoted Maurice Mitchell as describing the nature of the effort as, quote, the litigation space, the organizing space, and the political people just focused on the W, unquote. What was the W? Did it mean the win? And if so, for whom? Seeming to lack self-awareness of the fascistic nature of what she was describing, Ball persisted in detailing the effort under the euphemism, protecting the election. She proudly reported its, quote, unprecedented scale, unquote, framing the entire operation as a, quote, liberal alliance, unquote, which, quote, reached across the aisle into the world of Trump-skeptical Republicans appalled by his attacks on democracy, unquote. So what was this alliance's plan of attack? Job one, we learn, was, quote, overhauling America's bulky election infrastructure, unquote. Yes, a coalition of devoted partisans of one of the two candidates was going to save the election by overhauling the election system itself. What could possibly go wrong? Sidebar: Ball's misguided accusation. In his 2021 article, Why Do Most Countries Require Photo IDs? They Have Seen Massive Voter Fraud Problems, John Lott observed several things. First, virtually all of Europe and nearly all developed countries require in-person voters to use photo IDs to vote. Second, the vast majority of countries ban absentee ballots for people living in their country. Third, other countries have discovered widespread voter fraud when safeguards are not in place, and most significantly, fourth, unlike the U.S., few countries changed their voting rules for the pandemic. France temporarily allowed sick or at-risk individuals to vote absentee. Poland allowed mail-in ballots for everyone only for 2020. 2 cities in Russia allowed mail-in ballots. The rest? In-person voting, period. Molly Ball, in other words, was wrong to criticize Trump for crusading against mail voting. The United States stood basically alone in its hyperventilation over the dangers of in-person voting in 2020, and almost all other countries ban mail-in voting because they have learned from experience that it is dangerous to democracy. That is to say, almost every other country was on the same crusade against mail-in voting that Ball alleged Trump to have been on. Furthermore, far from preventing participation, Mexico saw an average 9% increase in voter participation in the 3 elections after implementation of strict anti-fraud rules, compared to the 3 elections prior to those rules being in place. Lott observed, as people gained faith in the electoral process, they became more likely to vote. The power of money. The first step in the process of the conspirators' election infrastructure overhaul plot was for the leftists in this coalition to give money to the mostly nonpartisan people administering the elections. This money was directed toward pushing absentee voting by sending out postcards, mailing ballots unsolicited to every single voter in some states, and paying for additional staff and scanners to process the ballots. The coalition lobbied Congress to direct COVID relief money to elections administration. The resultant CARES Act yielded $400 million in grants to state election administrators. However, Ball said, it wasn't going to be enough. Who would help America out of this dire predicament? Private philanthropy swooped in to fill the gap and save the day. Foremost among them, Ball informed us, was the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which ponied up $300 million. Remember, in the states that decided the election, as we have already seen in Chapter 3, the unsolicited mass mailing of absentee ballot applications or ballots is illegal. However, one Amber McReynolds of the National Vote at Home Initiative blamed the lack of funding to support these illegal activities upon the federal government. Quote, "It was a failure at the federal level that 2,500 local election officials were forced to apply for philanthropic grants to fill their needs," unquote. As of this writing, McReynolds' quote, nonpartisan, unquote, organization's website boasts about their work in the 2020 election. Quote, National Vote at Home Institute, NVAHI, has helped facilitate innovation of vote-at-home systems by offering policy and implementation recommendations, research, and communications support to states across the country. In 2020, the organization improved election operations in 2020 by providing assistance to numerous state and local election offices in 37 states, with a concentration in the key battleground states of Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, unquote. It is interesting that a, quote, nonpartisan, unquote, organization innocently pursuing the advance of voting from home across the nation would in 2020 have taken such a keen special interest in the battleground states, strongly concentrating their efforts in specifically those states, and would furthermore celebrate the outcome of those efforts, the election of Joe Biden and the ouster of Donald Trump, following one of the most controversial elections in U.S. history. Why? NVAHI's 2020 retrospective report advocates for no-excuse mail-in ballots, shaming states that require an excuse for a mail ballot, citing New Jersey as a success story, and reserving highest praise with a 5-star rating for California with their full vote-at-home model. These two states are famous for corruption in their elections. So, Ball continued, the Institute, quote, helped 37 states and D.C. bolster mail voting, unquote. But that was not enough. NVAHI, we learn, regularly deployed canvassers door-to-door to get out the vote. In 2020, NVAHI was not just concerned to make sure people had the opportunity to vote by mail. They wanted to make sure that people did vote by mail, quote, in key states, unquote. And they did so by sending out ballot applications to 15 million people in those states. Ball told of heightened skepticism. Black voters did not trust the mail. She did not ask why. Rather, the initiative was pushing voting by mail as a better way, quote, to ensure one's vote was counted, unquote, than even by voting in person. In fact, she asserted that voting by mail is the best way to ensure one's vote is counted. Meanwhile, there was the matter of whether all this was even legal. Ball related that Democratic lawyers were busy battling an, quote, historic tide of pre-election litigation, unquote. Wendy Weiss of the Brennan Center for Justice bemoaned litigation brought by the Trump campaign to raise doubt about mail voting. Why was it that Democratic lawyers were the only ones engaged in this $800 million, supposedly nonpartisan effort to ensure a, quote, safe and secure, unquote, election? Suppression of information. In a section about disinformation, Ball wrote about, quote, Trump's lies and conspiracy theories, unquote, without giving any concrete examples, much less a demonstration of why they were unfounded. She told, however, of Laura Quinn, a, quote, progressive operative, unquote, who led a, quote, nameless secret project, unquote, to track disinformation and, quote, dangerous lies, unquote, online. Quinn found that arguing with what she called disinformation was not effective, stating that engagement only made the content more likely to appear on searches, to be seen by more people. Having observed multiple news items classified as disinformation, most notably the October 2020 New York Post article on the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop as discussed earlier in this book, which was grudgingly admitted to have been true by even the most leftist outlets more than a year after the election, I do wonder if Quinn merely preferred to create an unlevel playing field in which truths inconvenient to her side could be suppressed. In any event, her chosen strategy became application of pressure on platforms to remove content labeled disinformation by progressive operative Laura Quinn and her allies. In November 2019, Ball-related, Mark Zuckerberg hosted a dinner at his home for 9 individuals who made use of the evening to warn him about the danger of such, quote, falsehoods, unquote, spreading unchecked. They evidently applied great pressure to Zuckerberg and others to take action and suppress information that these individuals, presumably all Democrats, and their allies deemed misinformation. And Zuckerberg was not their only target. Vanita Gupta, who was at the dinner, relates having similarly pressured Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey and others. And she met her reward. Immediately upon Biden's inauguration, he nominated Gupta for Attorney General, with the confirmation taking place in April. Propaganda. But stopping, quote, misinformation, unquote, such as Trump's assertion that voting by mail was an invitation to widespread fraud, was not enough, Ball said. Podhorzer's coalition also needed an active campaign to affirmatively convince Americans that millions of ballots sent through the mail, often to addresses where people no longer lived, or addressed to individuals who were deceased, or to people known not to vote but whose mailboxes could be easily accessed by nefarious actors, quote, weren't susceptible to fraud, unquote, and further, to convince them that, quote, it would be normal if some states weren't finished counting votes on election night, unquote. Put differently, they needed to conduct psychological operations, PSYOPs, on the nation to prepare a critical mass of Americans to disbelieve their own eyes and accept, or even better, to defend as credible, what this group of leftist operatives was already scheming to perpetuate in November. One arm of this operation was to be spearheaded by Dick Gephardt. The former Democratic congressman gathered a network of former elected officials, military leaders, and others, and began a messaging campaign to the public simultaneous to targeting key secretaries of state, governors, and attorneys general. Gephardt raised $20 million in private money for the effort. The appearance of nonpartisanship was of obvious importance. Former Congressman Zach Wamp, one of the Trump-skeptical Republicans, filled that role. Wamp headed up a group of 22 Democrats and an equal number of Republicans through a group that Ball claimed was nonpartisan called Issue 1. A glance at Issue 1's website quickly reveals it to have a strong Democrat bias, as evidenced, among other things, by the fact that the very first sentence one encounters on its page about the 2020 election is the claim, quote, the 2020 election was the most secure in history, unquote. It seems an odd position, absent the slightest hesitation or least qualification, for an organization whose ostensible core mission is integrity of democracy, elections, and ethics. The Issue 1 website gives credence to the partisan January 6 committee, see discussion in the introduction of this book, and in fact formally praises what it calls the, quote, bipartisan January 6th investigation, unquote. Wamp's subgroup was called the National Council on Election Integrity. It ran ads in 6 states, presumably the 2020 swing states, and wrote articles in favor of election integrity. Wamp claimed that the group had, quote, rabid, unquote, Trump supporters on board as well, but does not name them. 2 other groups, the Voting Rights Lab and Into Action, again, both obviously geared toward leftist political objectives, with the former being a project of the New Venture Fund and stating, quote, Democracy Donors, a liberal donor group, has listed the Voting Rights Lab as a top organization to fund, unquote, were involved in creating and disseminating the propaganda that, quote, every vote be counted, unquote, via email, text message, and social media. The message was going to be especially important in the overall push to remove security safeguards such as signature verification. And the campaign was not small. With the help of donors, Ball claimed that this messaging was seen more than 1 billion times. Tracking polls run by the organization soon found that the campaign was having the desired effect. A late October poll revealed that over 70% of respondents had been imbued with the expectation that there would be no winner known on election night. Meanwhile, Podhorzer was noting the polls were underestimating Trump's support. He therefore made his data available, prior to Election Day, to the media organizations who would be calling the election. These data, Ball said, alerted them to how much better Trump was likely to do on Election Day than they had expected. Planning an uprising in case of a Trump victory. Organizers who had been part of the Marxist M4BL movement and the far-left Democracy Defense Coalition, which included Move On, the Working Families Party, People's Action, and Color of Change, among a total of more than 150 liberal groups joined, Ball reported, to plan widespread protests if Trump, quote, tried to steal the election, unquote. How would they know if Trump tried to steal the election? We are not told. However, Ball describes that the coalition would be activated via text message as soon as the day after the election so that they could, quote, flood the streets, unquote, if the, quote, coup they feared, unquote, materialized. It is eminently worth pondering what a, quote, coup, unquote, by Trump would have looked like on November 4th. What was President Trump, the then current occupant of the White House, going to do to effect such a coup? Occupy the White House? Or were they merely preparing to take to the streets if Trump happened to pull out a victory, with these leftist organizations claiming without evidence that he had cheated? It is in such a context that the shrill derision of Trump for making similar claims that the left had stolen the election is interesting. It seems quite evident that this coalition had been planning for months to do exactly that in the face of even a manifestly legitimate Trump victory. USCC and Christian organizations jump in. 1 week before Election Day, Ball stated that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the single largest lobbying group in the United States, reached out to Podhorzer. Ordinarily at odds with Podhorzer and his union, the violent protests and destruction over the previous summer and the threats of further disruption of business if Trump were not ousted had apparently had their desired intimidating effect. The chamber released a pre-election statement reinforcing the, quote, count every vote, unquote, and, quote, don't expect to know the winner on election night, unquote, message. Neil Bradley, the chamber's executive vice president, now wanted to issue a joint statement with Podhorzer on the matter, pledging shared commitment to, quote, a fair and peaceful election, unquote. The statement was crafted and endorsed by some Christian leaders before its release on Election Day under the names of Chamber CEO Thomas Donahue and AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka, along with leaders of the National Association of Evangelicals and the National African American Clergy Network. The statement admirably called for the process to be allowed, quote, to proceed without violence, intimidation, or any other tactic that makes us weaker as a nation, unquote. Election night. Ball next told about Democrat despair on election night. She presented Podhorzer as a calm figure amid the storm who observed exactly what he had expected. He, quote, could tell that as long as all the votes were counted, Trump would lose, unquote. Ball did not say, quote, all the legitimate votes, unquote, but rather, quote, all the votes, unquote. This detail should be remembered in light of the information in chapters 3 and 4, and as you read forward through chapter 9. The conspirators, Ball reported, gathered for an 11 o'clock p.m. call on Zoom. Quote, hundreds joined, many were freaking out, unquote. Podhorzer, however, quote, presented data to show that victory was in hand, unquote. Then, Fox News called Arizona for Biden. Ball explicitly tied this early call by Fox to the earlier relationships cultivated between the conspirators and the news networks and TV anchors. Still, the coalition were ready to mobilize their mass protests. However, they were careful since they were aware that a poorly timed show of strength could backfire by leading to violence that she stated would give Trump a reason to send in federal troops. The conspirators intended to send a message that, quote, the people had spoken, unquote, and not give credence to Trump's claims of a coup. The coalition thus told their national anti-Trump mob to stand down for now, and they did for the rest of the week. The plan was now, Ball said, to project a national impression that Biden had won. Quote, counter their disinfo with our confidence and get ready to celebrate, unquote, was the guidance sent around to the conspirators on Friday, November 6th. Quote, declare and fortify our win. Vibe confident, not passive, anxious, unquote. Remember that the stated goal of the conspirators had been to protect a fair and honest process. However, their, quote, win, unquote, was entirely centered around an alleged Biden victory. The integrity of the process seemed merely a talking point from here forward. Blocking transparency to secure Biden victory. President Trump had been warning of major vote fraud in urban centers for months, all the more so with the massive opportunities that had been opened through the millions of mail-in ballots in circulation and the proliferation of ballot drop boxes concentrated in heavily Democrat areas of swing states. As the nation's attention thus settled upon the hotspots, the task of the coalition of Molly Ball's conspirators was to move into a phase of obstructing observers and election integrity groups. Art Reyes III was on the job. He created a massive text chain to counter the GOP observers at the TCF Center in Detroit. The coalition decided to try to claim the moral high ground by demagoguing the, quote, people's right to decide, unquote, and, importantly, suggesting that calls for honest elections were really a racial issue aimed at denying black Detroiters their votes. Flooding Wayne County's Canvassing Board's certification meeting on November 17th, activists on Reyes' text chain were part of the mob intimidating William Hartman and Monica Palmer, calling them racist for asking for answers, threatening violence against them and their families unless they voted to certify, and so forth, as described in their affidavits printed in Chapter 3. But the election boards were only one prong. The state legislature in Michigan also had a great deal of power in the process. Accordingly, the conspirators did a deep dive on key lawmakers' personal and political histories, and then Issue 1 ran television ads in Lansing. Never Trumper Womp prevailed upon former colleague Mike Rogers to write an op-ed for the Detroit papers calling for officials to, quote, honor the will of the voters, unquote. Rogers' piece repeated the, quote, count every ballot, unquote, mantra. Conspicuously absent was the word legal in front of the word ballot. He further framed a failure to ignore election integrity concerns, as though taking them seriously would compromise national security by delaying Biden's transition team. Protect Democracy also targeted 3 former Michigan governors, 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, and prevailed upon them to issue a joint statement calling for certification of Michigan's electoral votes for Joe Biden without further inquiry. Behind the scenes, John Engler, one of the 3, made phone calls to major donors and others who could apply pressure to lawmakers on the matter. Ball described the standoff as one between, quote, pro-democracy forces, unquote, and, quote, a Trumpified Michigan GOP, unquote, implying that Trump supporters were against democracy itself. On the side of the alleged anti-democracy, GOP, were the powerful Ronna McDaniel and former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, both influential, and the latter a member of a billionaire family. Having already labeled McDaniel and DeVos as standing against democracy, Ball proceeded to imply that these two and their allies might corruptly influence the outcome. Nowhere did she acknowledge a valid concern over election integrity, or address any of the issues that were raised and that have been discussed elsewhere in this book. Ball concluded her article with a description of the final effort to intimidate the state canvassing board into certifying the election. After a live stream and Twitter hashtag drew thousands to the certification meeting, Republican Aaron Van Langeveld folded under the pressure, giving the necessary third vote to certify. The other Republican abstained. The 4 other states in question, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and the others, followed suit by certifying their electors. January 6th, the final hurdle. On January 6th, Congress was to meet to count the electors from the states. President Trump had called those supporting him to gather on the National Mall that day for a rally. As Ball described it, Trump addressed the crowd and, quote, peddled the lie that lawmakers or Vice President Mike Pence could reject states' electoral votes, unquote. Then, she said, the crowd, quote, sacked the building, unquote, after Trump had told them to go to the Capitol and, quote, fight like hell, unquote. After thus framing the events, she stated that it was Trump's, quote, final attack on democracy, and once again it failed, unquote. Molly Ball's final analysis. Ball concluded by claiming that, quote, democracy won in the end, unquote, and, quote, the will of the people prevailed, unquote. Study questions. 1. Why do you suppose Americans who voted for Trump found the content of Molly Ball's article so frustrating? 2. Ball described the effort to, quote, save, unquote, the election as bipartisan, meaning that people from both parties were participating in the effort. Does bipartisan mean neutral? If they were given the choice between a fair election and a Biden victory, which do you feel would have been the top priority of the participants in this effort that Ball calls a conspiracy? 3. Do you believe that Ball would have written this article praising the effort and all of the participants if the 2020 election had been perfectly fair and secure but Trump had emerged the winner? Why or why not?